In this video, I will discuss the steps for creating an effective rubric. To begin, I'm going to first discuss a non-example. Checklists are often confused as rubrics, and that's a problem because they cannot work in the same way that rubrics are intended. Consider how this checklist for a lab report does not provide the feedback students can use to improve their learning. Although requirements are stated for this assignment, how will students know what is expected with broad terms like clear and sufficient? When a student receives partial points, how clear is it to the student what they did right and what they were missing? In this example, how clear is the rationale for 10 out of 15 points? After all, nothing in the criteria mentions a requirement of a line graph. There is an option for the teacher to give feedback, but does the feedback indicate to the student what they should do in their next phase of learning? My guess is that the student saw that they received a good grade and moved on, reflecting little, if at all, on the feedback provided. There are also concerns about the point values on this checklist. The student can do reasonably well on this assignment if they summarize the experiment and include proper labels. The heavy lifting of this assignment, drawing conclusions, is only 25% of the grade. So if the student can regurgitate the process of a lab accurately but can't draw any conclusions about the work and the significance, they still show up as an average student with 75% on this assignment. Checklists can be a viable tool in the assessment for learning process, but they are not a replacement for rubrics. On the other hand, there was a lot of good thinking in that checklist that, with some work, could become a full rubric to inform students about the quality of their work. The first step in creating a rubric is to identify what learning is expected of the students, and this is where your clear learning targets will pay off. Imagine looking at student work and thinking, yes, this is exactly what is expected. Describe what you would see. To write a lab report, I have a learning target that the students need to summarize the procedures of a lab process. When I think of what that would look like, I see each step of the lab process included and organized in sequential order. Concise statements describe the work without every single detail included. This is a skill I model and practice with my students and expect them to eventually do independently. My next step is to describe what a clear no would look like. Again, I use descriptive language that clearly defines how the work is missing the target. This would include missing steps and unorganized writing. One best practice in rubric writing is to avoid no or not in the description. Instead, focus on what the work looks like when it's not meeting expectation rather than what is absent from work. Next, I define what student work looks like when it is approaching the expectation. When I look at this work, I say no, but I can clearly see the student is getting close to the target. When I think about this level of work, some criteria may be present, but misconceptions may be visible. For instance, one issue students struggle with is developing concise summaries and instead explain with too much detail. Finally, I need to understand what it looks like when a student exceeds the learning target and I think to myself, yes. I might identify skills students are doing at a next level of learning or identify how the student is extending their understanding or presenting a different point of view. It is through this process I have created a progression of learning for a rubric. By identifying what student work looks like when it meets and does not meet the target and steps in between, it becomes more defined and clear for both student and teacher. In rubric format, it looks like this. I identify the criteria I am assessing and the performance levels of each trait. I avoid ambiguous words like clearly and sufficiently that can result in different interpretations. You may remember from the original checklist that there were additional criterion for the methods section. This section requires a list of materials used in the lab. Listing materials is not a learning target. It did not require teaching on my part, but my students know how to do this and it's an expectation for a lab report. To keep my focus on feedback to students on their new learning, I might create a list of must-haves for the lab report. In other words, I will require all lab reports to include a materials list along with a few other key elements that students already know how to do. If the lab report is submitted without the must-haves, I will require the student to revise the report before I assess it. In this way, I can maintain expectations for previously learned skills without having to provide feedback on what should be secure. An effective rubric identifies the criteria that is most appropriate and important to assess. Most of the time, these should be linked to your learning targets. Rubric descriptors must be definable, with clear, agreed-upon meanings that both students and teachers can understand. The criteria must be observable, something that can be read, heard, viewed, or performed live. Each description needs to be distinct from one another so that each aspect of quality can receive appropriate feedback. Descriptions must be written to support a continuum of quality, helping students to identify their status along a progression of learning. Altogether, the rubric should provide a complete description of the learning students need to show. Descriptions should allow for multiple pathways for students to be successful. These characteristics will help you evaluate the rubrics you'll create and use with your students.